Good evening. My name is Brad Power. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Englewood. Welcome everyone to the first of our outreach meetings to the community on a very important topic for the future of Englewood. Our development code is the thing that guides all of the development and investment in the community. So obviously the private sector builds things, but the community gets to make the rules. And the rules haven't been comprehensively assessed and changed in this community in almost 20 years. And when you think about the type of change that can happen in a community over that period of time, we decided, given the fact that there's a lot of investment building going on, not only in Englewood, but throughout the metro area, that now's the right time to take a look at the next generation of the character of the development of this community. So I want to thank everybody who joined us here today at the Civic Center community room, and those folks who've joined online. You're going to hear some interesting information tonight about how we're going about the approach of this project and this effort. And we really want to count on your participation. This is just a start. And we're going to give you some homework as we go over time to start to look around in the community of what you think works, what could be improved, what we could think about in terms of changes to our code to guide the pace of development in this community for the next generation. So again, thanks for joining us. We're looking forward to the voyage over the next 10, 12 months or so. With that, I want to introduce Brooke Bell, a senior planner on our staff, who will spend a few minutes going over some of the objectives for this evening, and then we'll carry on with the presentation. So take it away, Brooke.
Thank you. Again, my name is Brooke Bell. I'm a senior planner with the Community Development Department. And I want to thank everyone also for coming tonight. Appreciate it. I'm glad the weather broke and glad to see your faces here. We're also, not only are we doing this in person, but we have a Zoom meeting, and this is streaming live on YouTube. And we'll be able to bring those people into the later to participate as well. I want to thank some other folks for being here. We've got some staff sprinkled around the room. We've got members of the public, citizens. We've got a few members of our Planning and Zoning Commission and Steering Committee that we've been working on this CodeNext project with. And we even have a council member here. Welcome, Council Member Anderson. And so I just want to talk a little bit about how tonight is going to go. We're also here with our consultant, Gould Evans, Chris Brewster, and Matt. And Chris is going to be started out with a presentation on where we've been with our CodeNext project, where we're going, and then we're going to get into 5 of our kind of high priority topics. And Chris is, in going through his PowerPoint, he's going to introduce those topics and some of the work that the steering committee has already done this far. And then on each topic, we're going to pause, and Matt Ashby is going to open it up first to our live audience here to ask any questions, make any points, add anything that you think needs to be added to that topic. And then we're going to allow people on the Zoom side of things to join in on that. And you'll be able to see them on that screen when they do, when and if they do participate. And then we'll go to another topic. Chris will go through that again, and then we'll open it up for more public comment. And there'll be some topics that aren't even part of those 5 that you may want to talk about. So there'll also be time at the end for really any questions. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with kind of what's coming next as early as, sort of next week. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris with Gould Evans and start on our PowerPoint.
Thanks, Brooke. Chris Brewster with Gould Evans. Thanks for coming tonight. Again, just to recap, I'm going to give an introduction of the project so you all have an overview of what our scope and tasks are and the timeline, introduce our project team, recap some of the discussions that have happened to date, and then the key part of tonight is this is the kickoff of the public engagement. So we're teamed with Matt Ashby's firm, Ayers and Associates, who's engineering and planning firm, and they're helping us with any engineering related issues, public facilitation and planning issues. So we have a broad team beyond just us that are responsible for leading you all through this process over the next several months. And then of course the city and staff that we'll be relying on heavily as well. These are the project objectives. These are objectives on every code. As Brad mentioned, it's a decision-making tool, and we view it as that. We don't view it as just a collection of standards. We want all of these objectives that are in the city's RFP to hire us. We want to achieve all of these things through your development code. You don't get to update them often. So when you do, you want to take care and make sure it becomes a really long-lived decision-making tool that's meeting the planning goals. And the main part about this is the last one, that we want to implement Inglewood Forward, the comprehensive plan, and a lot of several other plans that have been done in follow-up to that plan. The city has lots of area plans. The council has a strategic plan. All of those documents are feeding into the policies behind everything we're going to do under this effort. But a big part of our effort is going to be simplifying things and making sure that this is a good decision-making tool for all members of the community as well. This is a big picture view of our project team as a whole. We're kind of at the bottom, staff, the planning consultant team, the people doing the day-to-day work, and we're kind of filtering up. So the technical committee will be other city departments and staff or other experts in the field that we're relying on. As Brooke mentioned, we have a broad steering committee that's made up of a cross-section of community members of different professions, many of them who are here tonight or who are online, that have been doing a lot of the work to this point, and then feeding on up to the council and planning commission ultimately. But some of the engagement strategies are on the left of the screen, and who we'll reach out to are on the right of the screen. But overall, this process is about getting the right information in the right hands at the right time, and having the right types of discussions over this period of the project so that we get issues addressed and questions answered. So we're breaking the approach of the engagement strategy into these three phases: listening sessions, of which we've been doing a lot of in the first preliminary months of the project, listening to what the community's issues are, what the ideas are. We're now shifting into options exploration, and that's when we're going to ask for input from you all. We're going to present a lot of options to you. We're going to introduce them tonight, but there'll be engagement tools online that are asking for thoughts, input, and feedback of what direction should we go. And from that feedback, that'll put us in a position to begin drafting the code. We don't even begin drafting a thing until we get some of those questions answered. So that's the route navigation part. And this is, we'll come back to this slide. This is the schedule for that. So tonight is the kickoff, which we're merely introducing how the next several months are going to go and some of the topics we're going to explore. And as Brooke said, we're asking you for, have we missed anything? What else do we want to know about? What else do we want to dive deeper into? Then from beginning mid next week through April, we'll be continuing to populate the CodeNext website with lots of documentation and things to help you explore some of these topics in a deeper level and begin to think about them and explore them, experience them in your own community, have observations, so that we come back in April for a public workshop where we're going to sit down and really start to address and hash out some of these issues and options and start to chart the course of directions that we want to go with some of these topics. So we'll come back to this slide, but this is the overall big picture map for that public engagement. This is our entire scope. So the first part, phase one and diagnose, is all the stuff that's happened that led us to this point tonight. We're beginning the second phase, which is align the issues and goals with the community's values and your plan. So we're just now beginning the engagement strategy. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the launch phase, phase three, that's when we start drafting solutions. And so we won't do that until we've had a lot of the feedback and input sessions from the public. So a lot of work beyond even our work got us to this point. Again, I mentioned earlier, we start with the city's plans and policies. So there's a list of some of those documents, and there's even more that's on the planning department's website. But those are really tell us the direction the community wants to go. And this project is about diving a little deeper onto, okay, which of those need regulatory strategies? Which of those do we want to change the regulations on? So a document that's also on the website that was produced in 2020 and released in the early parts of 2021 is a code assessment. There was a broad-based public engagement of that document that was assessing the code against plans and seeing which things were wrong. And so those 5 topics became the key priorities that the community wanted to address from that document. So when we jumped on board in 2021 through the RFP, that was our starting point. So that's how we got to this point of those documents that already looked into the development code and determined some of the priorities for the community. And so we started there as trying to verify issues from that point. These are the topics. This is a view of that document. So residential dimension standards and then the design standards for residential neighborhoods. Neighborhood character, what's the characteristics of different neighborhoods? Housing attainability, what price points are we offering housing at? Parking and walkability, and then sustainability and green infrastructure. So those were the 5 topics that came out as the priority from this code assessment. The steering committee then, beginning in early fall, started addressing those topics in detail. And so all of those meetings are on the CodeNext website as well. So lots of in-depth discussion and direction on each of those. And essentially it verified that those are the priority topics for this effort. Again, as Brooke mentioned, not that those are going to be the only things we address, but they are the big picture things that are going to be leading where we might change the code the most on some of these things. So I'm going to walk through those quickly to give a recap of what the steering committee discussed, and Matt will ask for any questions or things you think we might have missed on those, and figure out where we go from here on that. But so the first one, walkability and parking. So every code has parking standards in them. It's one of those things that it drives business, it's convenient, it's helping people get around the community, but your community is changing from a more car-oriented community to a more walkable or transit-oriented community. So there's a lot of challenges to how we address parking. And so these are some of the things that the committee discussed, that we want to optimize parking and look at parking differently in different contexts of the community. Too much parking is just as big a problem as too little parking. And how do we plan parking for the future for different types of mobility that we can't even anticipate right now? So those are some of the key priorities that the steering committee discussed that we need to address as we recalibrate your development code for the context the community's in right now. I won't read through all the bullet points on the screen, but I guess now's the time to pause to say, do you have any questions about parking issues, the development code as it relates to parking, or things that we might have missed in the discussion?
Or any thoughts from our steering committee members of kind of aha moments that you had during the discussions earlier last year? Yeah.
I just had a question that might not make a lot of sense, but very often I don't. But anyway, with all the new development and all that, and all the more people showing up and more buildings and all of that, I was just concerned somewhat about, and I understand you're pressing more toward getting away from vehicles, but the current streets are already pretty jammed up. And how would you go about it? Or can you widen? I don't know if it's practical to widen some of these streets if you bring more people in this area, or if it's even necessary. I don't know.
Good question. Certainly the development codes do address streets and configurations. It's a little bit different here than in some communities where you're building a lot of new roads. So having that formula of how to build roads right.
We look at Hampton right here is very, very busy, and every year it gets busier. And if you add people around it or near it, and I realize you are getting more and more away from relying on vehicles all the time. I just don't know how that would work.
Yeah, you've hit on a really interesting challenge that I think the steering committee wrestled with in their discussions on this, and it's at some point you try to hit a tipping point, so to speak, of you don't get walkability or multimodal access until you have more things to do without a car, You don't get there by getting rid of the car either. So there's an inherent tension in this issue that you've touched on. And it does play into the street design as well, which that's our next topic actually. Because I think there's a trade-off that we're talking about in terms of on-street parking versus off-street parking. And so we'll have a series of exercises to start to explore that issue in more depth. I think the other thing you mentioned, the steering committee discussed in a lot of depth and detail is right now the development code addresses parking as a sort of the same for every area of the community, with the exception of the Broadway corridor, which has an exemption because of its development pattern. But with the light rail and with other mobility options, you're going to have some very distinct contexts even within your limited city limits that are going to demand different parking solutions. It won't be a one size fits all.
Other thoughts or comments? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to build a little bit on that one size fits all. We can't live with the residential areas having the exact same parking requirements as maybe some of the areas right next to the light rail station. And so we're kind of recognizing that, recognizing where those are going to be different and where we want to push for more density and have maybe less parking requirements to push that density, I think is really what we're trying to accomplish here. So, whether that's the wider streets, narrower street in some cases, that might actually be the right thing to do and narrow some of them up to reduce people from driving through quickly. I think that's what I notice a lot in Inglewood is some of the streets are too wide where people are flying down. So how do we slow that down? How do we make the best use of the space that we have is really what we're trying to get out of it.
If you look at Hampton, it's like everybody that lives out east works out west, and vice versa. I just sit and I watch sometimes. I stay off of Hampton, by the way, because I don't want to sit there in those long lines. So you can't control that very well. I mean, the outlying areas on either end. Continue to grow too.
And when you're talking about Hamden, I mean, CDOT is looking at the linkage study to make sure that they are the right size. And with the Broadway Hamden Bridge that's going to be happening, there's going to be some good and some challenging things that are going to happen also.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's okay. I think one of the things we discussed too is just value and land value as well. And that it's important to have some parking, but our land value is very high in Inglewood right now. People want to be here. And by having high parking minimums across the whole city, it's very expensive to build something with those parking minimums. So really thinking about where's the flexibility and how to make the parking appropriate for the areas of the city. And then I think by looking at both the parking and the walkability and some of the streetscape components that we discussed in our discussions, is also thinking about how do you keep the people who are just going from Lakewood out east or from Aurora back to Lakewood, get them to stop and spend some time and spend some money in Inglewood.
All right. Anybody else? Any thoughts? All right. We will try and go to anybody online that would like to make any comments on the topic of walkability and parking. As Chris mentioned earlier in the presentation, we're certainly just kicking off this process. And so tonight is really about getting an introduction as we dive into the issues deeper. So Nancy, anybody else online?
Ms. Adams, can you come off mute? Okay. Mr. Henning, can you hear me and can you come off mute?
All right. Well, we'll give it a little bit here, but I want to make sure that everybody knows that we're going to go through the topics, and certainly after it'll be open for discussion. So if we do have a topic that you think of something later on that you want to throw out to the group, we have that opportunity as well.
will you show the email or wherever people can send messages to or send questions to periodically? So if they're saying they're tired and they want to jump off, at least they have that information. If we can maybe throw it in the chat or something. Would be good.
Yeah, certainly. Nancy, if you're able to,
We can't get them to come in again.
okay.
I can't remove them. I've asked to unmute. And they're not unmuting.
All right. Well, we will move on to the next topic and hopefully circle back with any questions from our online folks here at the end of the presentation.
Yeah, so the next topic is walkability in streets. This didn't necessarily rise to the top in the code assessment as a separate topic, but it was embedded in walkability. But for the steering committee's purposes, we broke it out into a separate discussion item. Obviously, as you heard from the questions, very much related to transportation and parking as well. Streets do serve a parking role in different contexts and in neighborhoods and commercial corridors, but they also serve many other functions. As Matt mentioned, your Inglewood is different than other communities because you're not necessarily building lots of new streets, so you're not regulating streets into existence. But as redevelopment does occur, streets are rebuilt, reconstructed, reconfigured. So we are looking at the street standards that are in the current code and figuring out how we recalibrate those to account for new context, to improve walkability and improve some of the goals that are in your plans and policies. The current code has very minimal standards on streets and streetscape design. So they're just minimum right-of-way widths, minimum street widths, minimum sidewalk widths. They don't deal with a lot of the other elements that improve multimodal, bike, walking, transit. So they're sort of silent to that on the development code side. Now, the city has lots of other street planning documents that do address that. So one of the things the steering committee discussed was we need better coordination among all the different documents that deal with street design so that we know where the decisions are being made and how they're being made from. So coordinating all of those different decision-making tools is going to be part of this development code update. Whether it lives in the development code or lives elsewhere, we're not sure, but we certainly don't want those documents conflicting or leaving questions open. So with that, the five main things the steering committee discussed was that coordination of the development code with other city guidance, making sure we're thinking of streets as welcoming active social spaces, not just for moving cars. Again, the theme that keeps rising up, different solutions for different contexts. So parts of Hamden are different than the Broadway corridor, even though they might be the same street classification. So how do we account for that, particularly as development or redevelopment occurs? Certainly improving bicycles as a key point of the transportation system, not just for recreation, was a very strong point discussed by the committee. And then the last one, as you know, you're built out in terms of streets. So again, most of what will be done will be on an incremental or interim basis. And so how do we come up with cost-effective solutions to do the best we can with the limited right-of-way you can? So that's where we're at as we go into the issues exploration session. So any questions or thoughts on those topics?
So not a small list of things to tackle on streets and walkability. Any thoughts or observations or questions of items relating to things the steering committee has discussed, or maybe other ideas you have regarding walkability in streets?
Hi, I'm PJ Kolnick. Question for you guys, as you've done this in several other communities across the Front Range or just across the country, but when you've been trying to retroactively widen sidewalks, have you found it to be more cost effective to widen the sidewalk by maybe increasing the easement on people's property and then compensating them, or maybe narrowing the roadway and widening the sidewalks on either side?
Yeah, so both good questions. Usually we're trying to accomplish all of it within existing right-of-way. Acquiring land and easement from people is difficult, and it's on a property by property basis. You're only dealing with limited chunks to be able to do, you need to be thinking of your streets as blocks and beyond blocks to redo them effectively. So it's a difficult proposition if you're going beyond the existing right-of-way. I think in a lot of places, there's, where the right-of-way line is based on where the sidewalk is kind of an eye-opening exercise for a lot of people, because sometimes there's a lot more right-of-way than people anticipate, and it might be public property even though it's been thought of as someone's front yard. So those are all complicating issues that we deal with. To your first question though of widening, it is easier to narrow streets in most cases, because streets, sometimes travel lanes are too wide or there's excess space. So gaining that space is usually easier going in, but there's a cost to that. Realigning curbs and drainage ways can get quite expensive too. So those are all challenges to wrestle with as we think about these.
Yeah, the widening sidewalks would be a major undertaking. My other question too is, does the ADA Act require a certain width of sidewalk, and would that prompt Englewood to have to widen their sidewalks as a result in areas where they may only be 2 feet or 3 feet?
Yeah, so first part of your question is easy to answer. Yes, it does, and I believe 5 is, there's different guidance. In some places, I think it does accept 4, but 5 is usually the minimum we're thinking about. So it does provide that minimum standard. The second question of when a city that's not in compliance has to comply is a little bit more difficult to answer. I don't know if you guys have the answer off the top of your head, but it can get quite complicated on when a city is forced into compliance with ADA if there's no activity happening. Certainly new construction, all of that has to comply, but as far as going in and proactively or retroactively redoing a street, it does happen occasionally, but I don't know exactly the circumstances that would force that, because it is a big step.
Okay, thank you.
Would the cost of the widening of the sidewalks be borne by the city or the property owner?
So that's a good question to throw on the table of what should be done. My immediate response is most of what we're doing under the development code will be for standards that could kick in as development occurs. And so if something's being redeveloped, I think a good starting point is to absorb that in the development cost. And I think the city's already doing that in a lot of cases. Whether there's any kind of public-private partnership in doing that, I think is probably open to each project by project basis. But the assumption is these are being triggered through redevelopment, and therefore development costs should take care of it.
And that would include single-family homes?
It could, but that's going to be a challenge for the previous part that I mentioned, that doing it on a lot-by-lot basis isn't the most cost-effective way. So we need to all collectively be thinking of strategy of when do you hit a critical mass of where it's time to upgrade a whole block or a whole area, and how do we stage that over time as lot-by-lot redevelopment is happening.
And could that widening be under a time frame because of the ADA and certain time constraints that the law states that has to be done by if there's no redevelopment?
Yeah, that's the part I do not know specifically, but we can certainly begin looking into that. Yeah.
Good deal. Other questions?
I was just going to mention that context was definitely something that came up in these discussions with the streets. Because I think in the code now, there's typical setbacks for any kind of development, whether it's a 0-foot setback because you're trying to promote more walkability, which can be a best practice for that, but that doesn't necessarily take into consideration what's the street outside and what's the right of way. So if you only have a 4-foot sidewalk, is a 0-foot setback the right thing to do for that place, or do you need to kind of take that context a little bit more into consideration? So I think that's something we discussed quite a bit to be able to see what do you need from the right of way, or what can you get from the right of way versus what do you get from the property line. And we did talk about, and this kind of came up more in the sustainability about, are there opportunities to either widen sidewalks or rethink about how you use that right of way thinking that you still have to have drainage and all of that, but are there creative solutions to be able to have a better walking environment?
Yeah, it's amazing with community building that oftentimes things are not black and white, that, every circumstance is unique. And one of the things about the development code is that it needs to provide you with a series of options and tools to be able to address a variety of conditions. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have, is to build the tool in such a way that it functions for all of those different circumstances that you might face. Any other comments in the room? All right, we'll try again online.
Okay, so, Ms. Fuchs, did you have a question or want to comment? You can come off mute. You can come on camera if you'd like. I think we can hear you, Chris. We just can't see you. You ask a question. Does anyone else have a question while Ms. Fuchs tries to get her audio working? You can come off mute.
Okay, I think back to you, Chris.
Okay. So the next big issue was touched on in some of that discussion was sustainability. The city has a sustainability strategic plan. Inglewood Forward also has a sustainability component to it. But these are the main policies and plans talking about environmental stewardship, energy conservation, renewable energy, and then also water quality and conservation. The code right now is generally neutral to a lot of those topics, so it neither promotes nor inhibits those, but a lot of times development codes have some hidden barriers to some of the most sustainable practices. So we're going to begin looking at some of those issues. The other part about, particularly in development, well, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of the sustainability issues that are commonly talked about are dealt with through the building code, not necessarily the development code. And so as part of our steering committee discussions, the city building official came and gave an update and some information on where the building code is at on sustainability issues. So that's a parallel track that's going on with this. But for our purposes under the development code, we just want to make sure that there's nothing that the city's going to be exploring under the building code that we're inadvertently limiting or setting impediments to from a zoning standard or a development or design standard. So with that, the steering committee's discussion was to continue those ongoing discussions about coordinating with other codes. Mainly in the development code, reducing some of the site-specific impediments to better site planning that's more sustainable, whether that's planning for renewable energy, whether it's stormwater treatment and some of those things. And then also we talked quite a bit about the balance between those two. So the steering committee got into a big discussion of solar versus passive heating and cooling. So thinking in terms of protecting solar rights for solar energy, but sometimes a shady lot that's with buildings organized appropriately performs well environmentally too. What's the best answer? The development code probably won't answer that, but allowing people to answer it on a site-by-site basis for their own projects will be pretty important. So in general, just promoting best practices from site design at the smaller level. And then the last point was looking at some of those larger sustainability issues that we're already addressing through the general planning for the community. A more walkable, multimodal community is going to be more sustainable just because of the reduction of transportation impacts and things like that. So,
Very good. Thoughts on sustainability, questions, comments. I think as far as the steering committee discussions went, it was amazing to see the breadth of ideas and different elements that sustainability really touched upon. It was kind of eye-opening to say, oh, well, that's a huge issue. It could be a different code that we're not even dealing with at this point. So, you know, just a very overarching issue. So any thoughts, questions, observations? Yeah.
I just wanted to commend you on two of the things you said. One is thinking about what the building sustainability efforts might look like and making sure you're not in their way. And I don't know what all you have in mind, but whether it's upcycle or recycle materials that are immediately dismissed because they're not allowed, if that becomes allowable, you don't want to stand in the way as the development code. Anyway, I appreciated that advanced coordination effort. And then the second thing is recognizing that there could be competing, and what's there may be best, whether it's sunlight or wind or shade, and not forcing one type of sustainability, but allowing the developer to contemplate what his design and what his specific site location allows for. I just want to commend you. I think that's really appropriate and good.
And I'll build off that. I think that's a tall order for you all to be able to do it, and I think that's what we want to go for. But one of the things that we kept running into is there's the building code side and then the development code side. And so recognizing that we're like, oh, well, we'll put this in, that might be more building code related. So, you know, I think the big thing is trying to not get in the way, like you were saying. But recognizing that as much as we'd love to do everything, some of that falls on the building code side of things that isn't part of this rewrite. So recognizing that we can't change or allow for everything as of right now is one of the things that we're looking at least.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, one of the things we're doing from a drafting the code standpoint is we address these issues usually in one of three ways. And the first way is having a standard on it. So some of these things may be difficult to have a standard or the standard on. The second way to address it is through decision-making criteria. So we talk a lot about wanting the code to be flexible. So sometimes in a development code, it's difficult to do that because, as Matt mentioned earlier, things aren't black and white. Well, a development code has to be as black and white as it can be, but we can deal with flexibility in different ways. But what we want to make sure we do is focus decision-making criteria. Anytime we have flexibility in the code, we need to know why we have it, what process it's going to go through, and what criteria we'll look for under it. So if it's a material design standard, maybe the code does have an impediment into it for other broader community design interests, but maybe there's also an easier way to get flexibility because this material is something no one thought of when they wrote the code, and actually it has a really high performance criteria on sustainability measures. And so we would want to build that decision-making criteria into the code so that people understand the bigger picture.
Good. Other thoughts from the live audience?
Since we're having difficulty with getting our online folks to be in, we do have a couple of comments from Melinda Ellswick. Comment on parking. I recently learned that the city of Hartford, Connecticut has abolished minimum parking requirements. This is environmentally friendly as it makes for few cars lining the streets and also preserves the character of its many historic districts, something to consider. Another question or comment from Janice Brown. We need sustainability in the development code like EV-ready parking and parking lots, more trees, low water, and landscaping. And Britt, if I see your hand, are you able to come off mute and ask your question? There's Britt. Can you come off mute? Because we can't hear you.
Hi, yes. Good evening. Yeah, I have a question regarding the comments of the multimodal, and just kind of curious about what kind of conversations have happened around the future of transportation, whether or not that ties into something like fast transit or otherwise, just in terms of the conversations around additional transportation ideas and where that's being discussed.
Yeah, from our standpoint, the plans and policies are really strong, first and foremost on walkability, which is good. Every trip starts with a pedestrian is what we like to say, whether it's a transit trip, an automobile trip or not. So the walkability is a good start. But again, obviously with the transit investment in this area, there's going to be areas of the community that there's already been substantial planning around more transit-oriented patterns and walkability being a foundation for that. Then the other part and I'll let any of the steering committee members chime in because there was a really robust discussion and they come at it from different perspectives. So incorporating bike transportation into the right-of-way and constrained right-of-way is a very strong initiative of the city too. There's a walk and wheel master plan, I believe is being updated right now as well too. So a lot of the policies from that effort are going to feed directly into what we do in the development code.
And I can be a bit more specific as in terms of my question regarding some of the test sites in Pueblo with Virgin Hyperloop and how that will connect into Wyoming and whether or not that actually will go through the metro. And so just wondering if there's an opportunity to plan for that when we're looking out further, whether that be in 5 or 10 years or so. Is there potential for something like that kind of transportation in terms of sustainable transportation models? Could that tie into Englewood as a station, and has that been discussed?
Well, the short answer for me is no. I just learned about it now, but I see a lot of people in the room kind of thinking and nodding their head. But I think if it's a stationary thing, the development code would probably take the lead from a plan or policy for that. But it's certainly something we'd want to be aware of developing the right types of zoning districts that could respond to future plans as well as the current plans on the books.
And I think just building off that, what we want is the flexibility for if that becomes a reality. What might even be a closer reality is micromobility, driverless cars, more like shuttle type facilities, especially down near the Englewood station, drone patterns, facilities like that are actively coming right now. I know they are doing test loops or test runs on the Hyperloop, so maybe that does become a reality. But I think, again, making it flexible enough that we don't preclude those future investments and future opportunities to be able to look into the future to do those. But there's also a lot of things that are coming very quickly and that we want to be cognizant of and make sure that we're planning space for. That goes to the electric cars also. Yeah.
Yes. And then lastly, also just connection points between the current stations or future planned station sites and how that actually, when you're talking about the biking and also walkability, how to get across Santa Fe, not only at Oxford, but then also just taking into consideration more population around that Dartmouth Santa Fe corridor and how those bridges are being tied in or planned for to bring more people to that Mary Carter Greenway Trail and River Point area and tie into Sheridan.
Thanks for the questions, Britt. And I think one of the interesting things in terms of timing right now is with a lot of the federal infrastructure dollars that are becoming available, we're actually working as an organization to look at some of those pedestrian bicycle connections to see if we could accelerate them in terms of their development. We've also talked to or required some of the developments to the south of us here to contribute to the future of some of those connections when they've been approved. So hopefully there's things on the front burner or moving toward the front burner that we can finally have some of those bridge connections happen. The one at Oxford, over Oxford, is actually going to be completed later this year. So we're underway on some of them.
Excellent. Thank you.
I think just one other additional thing to add, kind of to go with the walk and bike connections, as well as thinking about walking and biking for transportation, not just recreation. Is that with our streetscape piece, really thinking about what makes bicycling comfortable and safe so people actually do it. And so looking at options for creating more standards for grade separated and actual separated bike lanes and things like that. And I think some of that goes into the walk and wheel update and all of that, but just knowing that slapping a Sharrow on a street does not make it safe or in any way make someone want to go and bike on that street. So really elevating the standards for our streets.
Thank you. Any other online comments? All right.
If I could just add one other thing.
Certainly.
Thank you. I love what she just said about elevating that bike potential. So being able to have even the bike path included in a bridge concept that might be a different bridge than what we're talking about Oxford, because of course we're looking longer term. So the potential for that second connection point being tied in right from Cushing Park, perhaps in that area, all the way up to the bike path, Mary Carter Greenway, having an ability to have a bike path that is actually elevated, and that would be brilliant. I think it would be really neat to, you've seen models like that where, you know, there are bike transport potential just on bridges that, yeah, include more than just pedestrian opportunities. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right.
This is probably the chance for me to put in one disclaimer on the transportation issue is most of these things we won't regulate into existence. As you can hear from the discussion, there's a lot of planning and policy and details that need to go into some of these facilities. But what the development code can do is have the standards and the criteria for how you think about these facilities with these priorities in order, so that when those plans do come along, we have the right decision-making tools to link them. But there's certainly lots of really exciting ideas being talked about in this community beyond this development code project that we need to be accounting for. But the code will only do so much. But it sounds like those discussions are really robust in Inglewood, which is good to hear.
Yeah, Chris, in looking at implementing a vision for a community, I like to say that there's 3 Ps and 2 Cs. You've got plans, policies, and programs, codes, and capital. So, you know, capital improvements, large projects are major investments that are usually undertaken by the city. Those play a huge factor in some of those infrastructure pieces. But the codes really deal with incremental change typically that happens one project at a time. So it's making sure that that development that happens is building towards the future that is identified in your plan. So, all right, Chris, with that, if you want to head to the next topic.
Next topic is housing options and neighborhood character. Obviously, one of the more deeper topics for this community. You've had a lot of infill development. You have a lot of desirable neighborhoods, and how do we maintain the best of that? You have a fully gridded out city, which presents loads of opportunity on all aspects of housing and neighborhoods. And so we're excited to help with the code. What your plans say is you want a mix of housing types to meet future needs. Diversifying your housing stock citywide is in your plans and policies. You want housing that supports those types of neighborhoods we've been talking about under all the other issues, the transportation and sustainability issues, and housing types that improve neighborhood design and improve the existing housing stock. The code has, for a city this small, you have a lot of residential zoning districts. The steering committee has discussed that. Do you need so many? Do you need so many that have maybe few distinctions between them? Can we simplify the development code to better align with different housing types? And then how do we better account for options that weren't thought about when the development code was written? We've had long discussions with a range of options to address that with the committee. One is the idea of exploring a code that's more based on building types rather than purely on density or thinking of housing as simply single family or multifamily, but thinking about the whole suite of housing options that are available. And will that give us better decision-making tools if we shift to a code based on that? The steering committee discussed maybe we need to relax lot coverage standards in exchange for smaller scale buildings in some areas. In other words, letting people go out further but not up as high. Again, that idea of trade-offs and flexibilities. Promoting ADUs in more contexts than you currently are was discussed. And then the last three are kind of all about creating better distinctions among the 8 main residential zoning districts that you already have right now. Again, some of those are very similar. Some of them are leading to similar outcomes and products. So if we're not achieving our desired results from those districts, what do we need to do to recalibrate them?
And Chris, one item just to clarify, ADUs are accessory dwelling units, often known as either granny flats or units that might be above a garage or a secondary unit in a basement. So one of the things that we do with the development code is try to clarify any topics so that we're clearly articulating, and it is a technical document, so that's the fine line we try to balance in making sure that we have the regulatory side of things, but also that we're not using so much jargon that we lose the understanding. So one of the things that Gould Evans has done effectively is brought in illustrations and visuals to codes, because a picture is worth 1,000 words, and certainly having an illustration of a code element is particularly helpful, and certainly on the housing and neighborhood character, it will be an important element of that chapter. So any thoughts, comments, or observations that folks would like to share?
We definitely had a lot of great discussions about this, and I know we will continue to have lots of discussions about this. I think one of the things that kind of going back to that idea that the land use code will only be able to do so much in this area as well, is that it does have the ability to think about reducing the emphasis on density and thinking more about building scale and mass, which then can create more opportunities for building more housing units in Inglewood, which then can impact the affordability. What I'm not sure if we explored yet is what our building code says about that. Like, I think it was Memphis just changed their building code, so I think you can go maybe up to 6 units, and it's still a residential code instead of moving into a commercial code. So it allows the building to happen more easily. I don't know if commercial is the right word, but they changed the code to be able to address that. So that's something to consider as well. What can this code do versus the building code for this particular section, as well as it won't impact necessarily the cost of land. So it could make the cost of land increase. So there has to be other ways to think about how we can keep housing affordable if that's also a value that we have.
Very good. And certainly that's one of the topics where policies and programs also come into play. So lots of different ways to address those issues. And I think one of our challenges is to identify what we can do within this code and then identify other solutions and provide that to the city and other organizations, frankly, to implement other opportunities as well. Other comments? Yeah. Guys are keeping me busy here. Yeah.
I'm glad to see ADUs mentioned and the flexibility at it. I actually wanted to mention something. Inglewood Can is a new citizen affordability initiative that I'm a part of, and PJ here is a part of, and we've been thinking a lot about it, particularly ADUs. But ADUs are now legal, but there's some poison pills that keep them from happening. And I think it's in the development code where you can eliminate some of those poison pills. The parking, the off-street parking is particularly, if you take parking away, you've got to replace it. But there's a handful of poison pills in the current ADU that I just wanted to mention so you guys are aware that we are aware and hoping to see that sort of affordability come to Inglewood in greater numbers, because they're just not happening. Even though they're legal, they're just not happening in our city. And so here's a couple I think that are just important. And I think they fall into this code, but maybe not. The owner occupancy requirement. It virtually guarantees that ADUs aren't going to be built if you put a strict owner occupancy requirement. The off-street parking, I mentioned that one. It makes it extremely expensive if you have to build over top of a garage. And allowing additional structural forms is a concept that we've been talking about at Inglewood CAN. And we just want, really, you don't want to force the most expensive type of construction. You want in the basement that was mentioned is currently just not really possible here. It should be. We want to be able to make it easy for homeowners who don't have $150,000 to spend to be able to provide a place for another person to live in Inglewood and afford it. And then increase the size limit. It's pretty, 650 feet is a limiting constraint to make it worth the bang for the buck. And so, at least on ADUs, Inglewood CAN has been thinking a lot about that, and we think there's some poison pills that this group could help us eliminate so that we actually do address both affordability and just bringing people to our community.
Great. Thank you.
Excuse me, could you tell me the name of that organization again, your organization?
Inglewood CAN. CAN stands for Citizens for Affordable Neighborhoods. It's newly formed. You're not going to find much on us out there if you search.
Very good. Other comments, other thoughts on housing? All right, we'll switch to online.
Yes, hello. So currently, there's an example in Denver where there's a group called Stackhouse, and they are using shipping containers, and they're 320 square feet, the 40-foot shipping containers, and they will be designed and built to stack and be able to remove. And that's actually a project that is it sounds like they're going to be available in August of 2022. And so certainly in terms of the development code and also other issues of reasons why that might not be possible currently, there are examples of this actually working or being planned for. And so whether or not it's actual shipping containers or smaller space solutions that are even, in line with the ADU code, but you're really focusing more on the opportunities, and this may be in the works, so yay if it is. But right in that light industrial area, whether or not it's on the east side of Santa Fe or really kind of honing in on those trailer parks, like what's happening when some of those trailer parks are being sold off. And currently one just was sold, and so I am curious to know those folks that are living in those trailer parks, what are their affordable options going to be, and how is Inglewood actually planning to provide options when those trailer parks do start to sell off, or whether or not they do, but just that's premium land right in there. So what are some thoughts around foresight or being able to plan for those alternatives? It's been a hot topic for me for many years, and I think this is a perfect time to really sink our teeth into what options will be available as an alternative to trailer homes. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Anyone care to elaborate further on that, or?
I think from the development code standpoint, certainly the building types and configuration and construction types that we've heard from all the comments are in our purview of things to address. What happens to certain projects as they transition is getting a little bit out of the realm. It's because it'll become a planning and policy issue, but we certainly want a code that's ready to react to all of those situations that are going on.
It looks like we've got a couple more online comments.
Michelle, do you want to unmute and come online?
Are you calling on me?
I am.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to speak to what the previous speaker was talking about. I'm on planning and zoning and for the city of Inglewood, and we have seen planning and zoning PUD proposals for residential development in the industrial area. So I think what you're talking about is very timely, because as we keep seeing these PUDs, eventually we might need to look at the code and maybe, I mean, I don't think it's building code, but our code to see, and at least plan for the future that that's going to happen much more. Look at what happened to Rhino. Rhino was a bunch of warehouses and Pepsi distributorship and all that sort of stuff along Brighton Boulevard. And now we're seeing developers interested in taking some of the properties in Inglewood zoned as industry and turning it residential. So your comment is very timely.
Thank you, Michelle. Anything else online? Okay, other thoughts within the room here? All right, very good.
So that gets us through all of the big major topics. And again, it's only the start of the discussion. What we're about to engage in is we are preparing a series of online interactive exercises that are going to go through a lot of the issues we've heard people raise already tonight and explore some of those even further. And the whole idea is that we would spend the next 6 to 8 weeks building that sort of library of issues, options, things to think about through the Inglewood CodeNext webpage. And then that would set us up to come back together as a group in April for a public workshop where all of these issues are talked about in depth, in detail, and we begin to start to establish priorities of which of these options are best, which of these options are the best fit for Inglewood, which of these options are the best fit for certain areas of Inglewood. So this is only the start of the discussion. I'm encouraged by all of the great ideas we've heard. We've been thinking about some of them on our own. We've heard new ones tonight that we need to be thinking about. But anyway, this is the part of the presentation where we're saying the homework that Brad mentioned is going to start beginning next week. So I think around Tuesday, you'll see all of these issues begin to be populated on the CodeNext webpage with an interactive presentation that then prompts you to think further about these issues and opportunities, and that's all in way of preparing for a workshop on April 13th or 14th. It's tentative, we haven't set the date yet, but that'll be coming as well. From there, that's where we begin to start charting the course forward. What things do we regulate for? Which options are people seeming to gravitate towards? What strategies do we need to take in the code? And that will take us through the April through August months, but it's only the beginning, I guess. So this is a little bit of preview of some of the things you'll see online. It's just there will be several of these interactive exercises that are prompting you to think about property differently. It won't cover everything, and in fact, we hope it prompts you to think about lots more things that you come to the meetings in April prepared to discuss with us in depth and in detail. So again, the bigger picture schedule is our engagement is just kicking off now. It's going to be from February through August. We'll begin drafting portions of the code in March, some of the more technical things, and then trying to match that with how we're evolving on some of those discussions. And then our goal is to begin filtering up drafts of the development code to the steering committee beginning in May and complete in August. And our target is to have a code that we all recommend and is reflective of the public engagement by about November, I think, is our target date to have something that we feel is a recommended adoption draft for how to update the code. So with that, open up to any other lingering questions. The comment earlier of where to put comments, where to react to. These links, the phone number that's listed there, the planning staff is already accepting all kinds of comments and feedback on that webpage and wants to continue to do so. So that's where we're leaving off tonight. With any other discussion you might want to engage in on any of these topics or other topics that we've missed, we're open to that as well. So.
So is the idea that I guess the code would become effective January 1st, 2022, if accepted by some governing body?
Yeah, that's a good question. That hasn't been determined yet. Obviously, the way a code has to be adopted is that it will go to the Planning Commission for public hearings, and they will make a recommendation to the City Council, and the City Council will need to adopt it. So what that schedule is will kind of depend on where we're at when we begin to draft the solutions. Whether it becomes effective immediately or whether it becomes effective after some lag time is strategies different cities use. It sort of depends on where we think, if you're adopting a code that's really transformative and pushing the envelope on things, a lot of times you need to have a little bit of a lag time for people to understand it, or even adopt the code as a parallel code till the other one phases out. Those are all strategies. We prefer to have, set an effective date, and that's when it becomes effective. And hopefully our public engagement process gives us the, a comfort level that we're giving you a code that everyone's prepared for and agrees to, that we don't have to come up with some unique strategy. But that's to be determined, I think, but a good question.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in on that. That is an important question, process-wise. At the end of the day, the body that will make the final decision on our new code will be City Council. So as Chris mentioned, we're doing our public engagement right now. We're trying to get as many people involved as possible, as many ideas. At some point there'll be a draft that everyone will be able to comment on. But once it starts to solidify, there'll be a public hearing in front of the Planning and Zoning Commission that will be advertised, on the city's website and in the paper, and then they will make a recommendation to City Council, and then it will go to Council for another public hearing. These are both opportunities for you all to participate again if you'd like. So and then City Council makes the final decision. So there'll be a lot of hands on this project, but ultimately it will be City Council's decision.
And we do expect when we get to this schedule, kind of points out some of those key public inputs to get more information. Obviously our online engagement that we're about to begin, and then coming back as a group and discussing at a public meeting. But then we also expect to have several other kind of topic specific meetings. And then the last thing we do is when we feel like we're ready to recommend an adoption draft, we have a public review draft where we'll probably have a meeting like this where, the draft will be released and let you review it for a couple of weeks and then come ask us questions or identify things that we've missed too. So those are other opportunities that will be in the process for just the general public to be involved as well.
Hi there. I didn't hear if it's okay for me to talk at the moment.
Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So yes, thank you for your last comment about the public engagement topic-specific meetings and for allowing this to happen this evening. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be involved. And with those topic-specific meetings, certainly if there was an opportunity for a focus group or like a symposium that was separate, as breakout sessions, I think that's probably what you're referring to. And I'd be delighted to participate. So thank you for that.
Fantastic, thank you. Any other comments in the room or online? All right, before we conclude, I do want to thank all of our technical team and staff. Pulling off a meeting like this with both virtual and in-person engagement is not an easy feat. And we thank you all and the folks in the back for their efforts in streamlining all of this process. So, Brooke, do you want to close out?
Sure. Seeing that there's no other comments, we just really want to thank everybody for coming. We want to encourage you to look at the Inglewood Engaged portion of the city's website. Just look for the words Inglewood Engaged, look for the words CodeNext. There's a lot of information in there. You can ask any question. There's a section to ask questions, a section to leave a comment, not even a question. And at least on some of the questions, we'll do our best to answer some of those. There's a lot of material, and you can even go back and look at some of the stuff that we did this fall. But just stay engaged and go through some of the exercises as they come up and are placed online. Get familiar with that web page, and we just really appreciate you being involved and sticking with the process. It's a little bit of a lengthy process, but I think if we hang in there, we'll get a code that works for as many people as possible. It's never going to be perfect for everyone, but that really is updated, easy to use, and works for as many situations as possible. With that, unless you guys have any other comments, we'll go ahead and close this meeting. And again, drive careful, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone.